What if I told you that right now, as you're watching this, 4 nations are quietly building arsenals that could flip the entire balance of global power on its head, and literally nobody's talking about it? We're not talking about the usual suspects here. Not Russia, not China, not the United States. These are countries that have mastered the art of flying under the radar while stockpiling capabilities that would make superpowers sweat. And here's the wild part. They're doing it so quietly that by the time the world wakes up, it might already be too late to stop what's coming. See, everyone's obsessed with watching the big players throw their weight around. We're all glued to news about NATO exercises and Chinese naval drills and Russian saber rattling. But while we've been distracted by the obvious threats, 4 nations have been playing the long game, and their strategies are absolutely insane. These aren't rogue states or pariah nations. These are countries that have historically kept their heads down, maintained diplomatic poker faces, and convinced the world they're not interested in military dominance. And that's exactly what makes them so dangerous. Let's talk about Japan first, because honestly, this one's going to blow your mind. Most people think of Japan as this peaceful, pacifist nation that learned its lesson after World War II and decided to never again pursue military aggression. And yeah, that's technically true on paper. Article 9 of their constitution literally forbids them from maintaining offensive military capabilities. But here's where it gets crazy. Japan has been reinterpreting that constitution so creatively over the past decade that they've basically found every loophole imaginable. They don't call it a military anymore. They call it the Japan Self-Defense Forces. But make no mistake, this is one of the most technologically advanced and well-funded military organizations on the planet. Japan's defense budget just hit record levels, topping $50 billion annually, and they're projected to become the world's 3rd largest military spender within the next few years. They're building aircraft carriers, except they don't call them aircraft carriers because that would violate their constitution. They call them helicopter destroyers. But these ships can absolutely launch F-35 fighter jets, and they're doing exactly that. The Izumo-class destroyers are being retrofitted right now to operate fixed-wing aircraft, and when that conversion is complete, Japan will have legitimate power projection capabilities across the entire Indo-Pacific region. And it's not just about ships. Japan's military technology is legitimately cutting edge. They've developed the Type 10 main battle tank, which is specifically designed for Japan's mountainous terrain and can literally adjust its suspension height on the fly. Their submarine fleet is one of the quietest and most advanced in the world, with the Osoryu-class boats featuring air-independent propulsion systems that let them stay submerged for weeks. Real talk, some defense analysts consider Japanese submarines to be superior to anything China currently operates, and that's a massive deal when you consider the strategic choke points around the Japanese archipelago. But here's what really keeps Chinese military planners up at night. Japan has the technical capability to develop nuclear weapons incredibly fast if they ever decided to. We're talking months, not years. They've got plenty of plutonium from their civilian nuclear program. They've got the rocket technology from their space program. And they've got some of the world's best engineers and scientists. The only thing stopping them is political will. And that calculus could change real quick if they ever felt genuinely threatened. Some estimates suggest Japan could have a functional nuclear arsenal within 6 months of making the decision. That's absolutely wild when you think about it. Now let's shift gears to South Korea, because this country has quietly become a military powerhouse that nobody wants to mess with. When people think of the Korean Peninsula, they immediately think about the North Korean threat and all those missile tests. But South Korea has been preparing for war for 70 years straight, and their military capabilities are low-key terrifying. They've got mandatory military service, which means nearly every adult male has combat training. Their active duty military is over 600,000 strong, with millions more in reserves who could be mobilized within days. But the real game changer is South Korea's defense industry, which has exploded onto the global scene in the past decade. They're exporting advanced weapons systems all over the world now. Their K2 Black Panther tank is considered one of the most advanced main battle tanks ever built, with an autoloader that can fire 10 rounds per minute and an active protection system that can shoot down incoming missiles. Poland just ordered nearly 1,000 South Korean tanks and hundreds of self-propelled howitzers. Think about that for a second. A NATO member chose South Korean weapons over American or European alternatives. That's how good their stuff has become. And it gets crazier. South Korea is building its own fifth-generation fighter jet, the KF-21 Boramae, which is going to put them in an extremely exclusive club of nations capable of designing and producing advanced stealth aircraft. They're developing ballistic missiles with ranges that could strike anywhere in North Korea within minutes. They've got one of the most sophisticated naval fleets in Asia, including Aegis-equipped destroyers that can track and engage multiple ballistic missiles simultaneously. Their K9 Thunder self-propelled howitzer is literally the most exported artillery system in the world right now. Countries are lining up to buy South Korean weapons because they're high quality, reasonably priced, and come without all the political strings attached to American or European arms deals. Here's what makes South Korea particularly dangerous in a World War III scenario. They've been planning for total war on their own peninsula for decades, which means their entire military doctrine is built around rapid mobilization, combined arms warfare, and operating in an environment where the enemy could use weapons of mass destruction. They're not preparing for limited engagements or peacekeeping missions. They're preparing for existential conflict. And that mindset creates a military that's fundamentally different from forces designed for expeditionary operations. All right, let's talk about Turkey, because this one's complicated and honestly kind of fascinating. Turkey's been a NATO member since 1952, so technically they're supposed to be part of the Western Alliance. But over the past decade, Turkey's been playing both sides so effectively that nobody's entirely sure whose team they're actually on anymore. They've bought Russian S-400 air defense systems, which got them kicked out of the F-35 program, but they're still technically NATO allies. They've got military operations going on in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Azerbaijan. They've been flexing naval power in the Eastern Mediterranean, challenging Greek and European claims. They're basically acting like a regional superpower that doesn't need permission from anyone. Turkey's got the second largest standing military in NATO after the United States, with over 350,000 active personnel and millions more in reserves. But what's really interesting is how they've been developing their own indigenous defense industry because they can't rely on imports anymore after various arms embargoes and diplomatic tensions. They're building their own drones, and Turkish TB2 Bayraktar drones have been game changers in multiple conflicts. These relatively cheap, easy-to-produce unmanned aircraft have destroyed billions of dollars worth of tanks, air defense systems, and artillery in Syria, Libya, and especially in the Nagorno-Karabakh war, where they absolutely devastated Armenian forces. Turkey's working on their own fifth-generation fighter jet called the Ka-EN, their own main battle tank called the Altay, their own aircraft carrier, their own submarines, their own missiles. They're trying to create a completely self-sufficient defense industry, and they're making serious progress. The geopolitical implications are insane because Turkey controls the Turkish Straits, which are literally the only way for Russian naval forces to get from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. In any major conflict, Turkey's geographic position makes them absolutely critical, and they know it. They've got leverage over both NATO and Russia, and they're not afraid to use it. But here's where Turkey gets really unpredictable. Their government has been increasingly authoritarian and nationalistic, pursuing what they call neo-Ottoman foreign policy, basically trying to reassert influence over regions that were once part of the Ottoman Empire. They've got territorial disputes with Greece, tensions with Israel, complicated relationships with Iran, and they're actively involved in conflicts across the Middle East and North Africa. In a World War III scenario, it's genuinely unclear which side Turkey would actually fight on, and that uncertainty makes them incredibly dangerous. A NATO member with 500,000 troops and strategic control over critical waterways, who might not actually honor their alliance commitments, that's a nightmare scenario for Western military planners. Now let's talk about the wild card that nobody sees coming. Indonesia. Yeah, you heard that right. Most people don't think of Indonesia as a major military power, but this country is quietly building capabilities that could make them the dominant force in Southeast Asia. And the implications for global trade and naval warfare are absolutely massive. Indonesia's got nearly 300 million people, making it the fourth most populous country on Earth. They've got the largest economy in Southeast Asia. And here's the kicker. They control the Strait of Malacca and the Sunda Strait, which are two of the most important maritime choke points on the planet. Something like a quarter of all global trade passes through the Strait of Malacca. Nearly all of China's oil imports come through there. If Indonesia ever decided to close or even just threaten those straits, it would send shockwaves through the global economy that would make the Suez Canal blockage look like nothing. And Indonesia's been massively expanding their military capabilities, especially their Navy and Air Force, because they're spread across over 17,000 islands, spanning nearly 3,000 miles. They need power projection capabilities just to defend their own territory. But those same capabilities could be used offensively, if they chose. Indonesia's been buying advanced Russian fighter jets, submarines from South Korea, frigates from the Netherlands, and they're developing their own defense industry partnerships with Turkey and other countries. They're building up their Marine Corps, which is specifically designed for amphibious operations across their archipelago. And politically, Indonesia's been playing the neutrality card really effectively, maintaining relationships with both China and the United States, not committing firmly to either side. But their strategic location means they can't stay neutral forever. In any major Pacific conflict, Indonesia would be forced to pick a side, and their choice would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the region. Here's what makes these four countries so dangerous together. They're all in critical geographic positions. They're all building serious military capabilities, and none of them are clearly aligned with existing power blocks. Japan and South Korea are nominally U.S. allies, but both have increasingly independent foreign policies and populations that are skeptical of getting dragged into American conflicts. Turkey's technically NATO, but acting increasingly independent and even adversarial at times. Indonesia's playing both sides. In a World War III scenario, the question isn't just about whether the US and China go to war. It's about which side these four nations choose, or whether they form their own bloc entirely. Imagine this scenario. Tensions escalate between China and the US over Taiwan. China begins military operations, expecting their usual calculations about American response times and Allied support. But this time, Japan doesn't just provide basing and logistics support. They actively engage Chinese forces with their advanced submarines and F-35s operating from their helicopter destroyers. South Korea, worried about being vulnerable while the US is distracted, launches preemptive strikes against North Korean nuclear facilities. Turkey closes the straits to Russian warships and cuts off their Mediterranean access. Indonesia announces it's shutting down the Strait of Malacca to all military vessels from countries involved in the conflict, effectively strangling Chinese energy imports. Suddenly, what was supposed to be a limited regional conflict has exploded into something completely uncontrollable. China's facing a two-front war against technologically advanced opponents, while their economy is being strangled by blocked trade routes. Russia can't reinforce their Pacific fleet because Turkey's blocking them. North Korea's leadership is making desperate decisions because they're under attack. The global economy is in free fall because the world's most important shipping lanes are closed. And all because four countries that were supposed to be minor players decided to make major moves. The economic devastation would be immediate and catastrophic. Japan and South Korea are massive manufacturing hubs. Indonesia controls critical trade routes. Turkey connects Europe and Asia. If these four countries are actively involved in major combat operations, global supply chains don't just get disrupted. They completely collapse. We're talking about shortages of everything, from electronics to automobiles to medical supplies. Oil prices would skyrocket because tankers can't get through Indonesian waters. European industries would shut down because they can't get components from Asia. The United States would be forced to choose between supporting multiple allies simultaneously while trying to fight China, which would stretch American forces beyond their capabilities. And here's the thing that should really worry everyone. These four countries have all been quietly preparing for scenarios where they can't rely on traditional alliances. Japan's been diversifying their defense partnerships and building independent capabilities, precisely because they're not sure America would actually fight for them. South Korea's been doing the same thing, especially after previous US administrations questioned the value of the alliance. Turkey's already broken from NATO expectations multiple times. Indonesia is explicitly pursuing strategic autonomy. These aren't countries that are going to follow orders from Washington or Beijing. They're going to make decisions based on their own national interests, and that makes everything way more unpredictable and dangerous. The nuclear dimension makes this even more terrifying. Japan could go nuclear fast. South Korea's got the capability and has debated it publicly. Turkey's got American nuclear weapons stationed on their territory and controls whether those could even be used. Pakistan's nuclear weapons could potentially be accessed by Turkey through their close relationship. The proliferation risks in this scenario are absolutely off the charts. And once you've got regional powers going nuclear, the whole deterrence framework that kept the Cold War cold starts breaking down. You're not dealing with rational superpowers that understand mutually assured destruction anymore. You're dealing with regional rivals with historical grudges and existential fears making split-second decisions with world-ending weapons. What's really wild is how quickly this could all happen. These aren't capabilities that need to be built over decades. They exist right now. The weapon systems are deployed, the personnel are trained. The industrial capacity is there. The only thing missing is the political decision to actually use it all. And that decision could be made in hours if the circumstances were right. A Chinese blockade of Taiwan, a North Korean missile test gone wrong, a Turkish-Greek naval incident that escalates, an Indonesian government deciding to assert control over their territorial waters during a crisis. Any of these triggers could spiral into exactly the kind of multi-front conflict that brings in all four of these silent powers simultaneously. The most unsettling part is that this isn't some far-fetched fantasy scenario. The military buildups are happening right now. The political tensions are real. The strategic calculations are being made in capitals across these four countries as we speak. Defense planners in Tokyo, Seoul, Ankara, and Jakarta are gaming out scenarios that look a lot like what we've been talking about. They're preparing for a world where the old rules don't apply anymore, where traditional alliances might not hold, where regional powers have to be ready to act independently and decisively. So yeah, while everyone's been watching the obvious players and arguing about whether the US and China are going to fight over Taiwan, four nations have been quietly positioning themselves to potentially determine the entire outcome of any future global conflict. They've been weaponizing in the shadows, building capabilities that could change everything, and maintaining just enough ambiguity about their intentions that nobody knows for sure what they'll actually do when the moment comes. And that uncertainty, that unpredictability, that's what makes them so incredibly dangerous. Because in a crisis, when decisions need to be made fast and stakes are existential, these four silent nations could easily become the loudest voices on the battlefield, and the world might not be ready for what happens next.